Once again, good afternoon, and this is the last time. Welcome to the last panel debate. I am Nikola Hořejš, and here with me I have the honor of having three guests. Mrs. Jana Ustohalová from the Brno office of the Mladá fronta Dnes daily newspaper, investigative journalist who covered cases such as the rental of the Brno airport, the land fraud in Šlapanice, and IT contracts at the Brno town hall. Then I'd like to welcome Mr. Jan Kroupa, who I think doesn't really need an introduction, but perhaps for our international guests, an investigative journalist currently working for the Czech radio, who is well known due to his coverage of cases such as the Berdych gang case, the case of the purchase of army transporters for enormous prices. He's the holder of many journalism awards, as you can read in his biography. He's been involved in all sorts of investigative TV shows and all that. And then we have Mr. Jan Moláček from the Reportéři ČT, which is again a TV show on Czech TV. He was a foreign correspondent in various interesting places, and he's currently an investigative journalist for the Czech television. 7 to 8 years ago, I was researching Czech investigative journalists, and I was asking them what's their perception of whistleblowing and whistleblowers, which was back then a fairly new thing in the Czech context, and I learned that with some exceptions they had no idea what the term actually meant. So I want to ask now at the start of this, and perhaps Mr. Moláček would be the first one, if you perhaps could speculate what's the current situation in the media. Do you think that the journalists today know who whistleblowers are? Do they have an idea of what a whistleblowing means? Do they know what kind of category whistleblowers are and whether they should be protected? Good afternoon. I think that the situation is different than those 7 years ago, or what you said. I'm sure that people now know what whistleblowing means, but as we've seen in the brief debate that we had between us before this official panel started, it's not entirely clear if everyone agrees on who whistleblowers are, what's the Czech equivalent, what's the motivation to become a whistleblower, how do you get into this category, is your motivation relevant or not, are there some sort of limitations on who can be a whistleblower and who not. I think that journalists who deal with investigative journalism, who work with these kinds of issues like corruption and wrongdoings and conflict of interest and all that, I'm sure that these people come into contact with whistleblowers and they do know what it means. Mr. Kroupa, when we spoke before this debate, you told me that you always, whenever someone comes to you with some sort of information that could be considered whistleblowing, you always have your doubts because you think that it's difficult to consider them whistleblowers or sources or perhaps snitches because you don't know the whole context of the case. What do you do to resolve those doubts within yourself? Well, essentially, what all journalists should do is treat every source with a critical eye, no matter what the source, no matter what the information. And early on, in the early days of any larger investigation, where you have a source, which, to be honest, is not the case with most stories that break in the Czech media, because most journalists find it out by themselves and gather their sources ad hoc depending on what the situation is. Nevertheless, you have to realize that when someone comes to you with information about an important case, they are usually involved in some way or another. And you need to ask yourselves, why are they at this point in time, in this particular situation, willing to say something? And mostly means 90%, 99%, 50%. Well, majority means more than 50%. I can't really tell you exactly how many percent of cases it is, but our approach is basically always the same. I talk to the person, and when you talk to someone, you are trying to trust them. That's the whole point of dialogue. Early on, we have to just form an agreement. If you want to be our source, tell us the truth, because if once we figure out that you're lying, you are not a source and we cannot protect you in any way. If you tell the truth, we can protect you, and we have to protect you. But this still doesn't make the person a whistleblower, at least in the sense that I would use. And depending on the person's behavior and reactions and what they do, this shows you their behavior within the case. A classic example for me is someone I just met right here, Mr. Michalek, which was a case that I helped publish. I don't know if he's still there. He's there in the back. I also approached him early on critically. I was asking myself why someone who is at a high position in the state is talking to a journalist. Why is he willing to tell me details about this particular case? And just over time, he convinced me that his intentions were good. But he did not convince me by what he said, but what he did, which are two very different things. And if you encounter someone who you think does not have good intentions, if you think they are trying to settle some sort of old grievances, what do you do with that? Could you show an example? Of course. One of the large cases, the Berdych gang case, which, if you don't know the context, that was a gang of criminals who kidnapped entrepreneurs, but it was managed by people from the police, from the Organized Crime Investigation Unit, which was an elite unit of the police force. The story started with a letter from a prison sent to me, from a person who said, I've been sentenced for 12 years for kidnapping people, and I admit to that, but there should be more people here in jail with me, and I'll tell you who they are. And the story was uncovered from that, and I protect my source because he was at risk of death if I said that he was my source. But calling him a whistleblower, that would be perhaps sarcastic, because I don't think he really was. Mrs. Ustohalova, do you share the optimism of your colleagues? Do you think that the term whistleblower is now generally known among journalists? Or do you think the situation is different in a regional newspaper, which is where you work, or the regional office of a nationwide newspaper? Well, the situation in the regions is different. Absolutely is different from nationwide media, because, and this is something we also talked about, the links on the regional level are more stronger, be it social relationships or any other relationships. People are much more close to each other than when you're talking about nationwide cases that are often being handled. And the people, the whistleblowers, are much more afraid to disclose anything, even anonymously, because they are afraid that in a small town everyone's going to figure out what the source is sooner or later. So this sort of optimism from the regional perspective, I really don't share that. I mean the optimism in the fate of whistleblowers. I think the rest of the panel also isn't quite optimistic in that, but about your colleagues, journalists, that they are aware of what whistleblowing is, how whistleblowers should be approached, if they receive some sort of special treatment at all. Well, I don't know about my colleagues, but myself, I approach each of my sources, I approach all whistleblowers with a critical perspective. I seek motivation, and my work as a journalist is to verify. And to try to understand what is the source telling me. This is probably the most critical moment, I'd think, and I wanted to ask you, Mr. Monáček, what's the first contact with the whistleblower like? What do you tell the whistleblower? What's your advice? What do you try to determine? What are you telling them to do or not to do? I'm happiest in my job when the first contact, and this may sound paradoxical, when the first contact is that I find the whistleblower and I ask the question and they start telling me something. That's probably not whistleblowing as it's conventionally understood, but I always prefer when the person only speaks after I found the person, based on some information, some of my own investigations. Often it's the other way around, that we are contacted by whistleblowers. But the public often thinks, and I encounter this really very often, that investigative journalists receive a tip, they look at it, and they make a TV show out of it. This happens sometimes, yes, but it's far rarer than people usually think. I couldn't say what's the percentage, because it's different with each of us, but with me it could be perhaps 20% of cases that I cover in our program, so it's definitely not the most typical way of breaking a story in a show like the one I do. But when I do have a person and I know that they are an insider, that they have the information, then I try to work with them to get the information that I need. It's often just one specific piece of information that I know that if I get this, then I will be able to cover the story, and if I don't, I won't. And I often don't know exactly what sort of information I'm looking for, but I know that there's some kind of problem. I know that there is something shady, and I need to try to find my way into the case and to learn this. But what I want to know is, when you start to suspect that the person who gave you the information could be facing some sort of retaliation from their employer or anyone else. I don't mean necessarily threats, such as in the criminal gang case, but basically the threat of losing employment, anonymous phone calls, things like that. What do you do when this happens? Do you consider the effects on the whistleblower? Do you try to explain the situation? Do you try to mitigate the information? Well, the first thing I tell everyone, I'm saying, I'm here off the record, I'm not making any recording whatsoever, I am not telling anyone, unless we explicitly agree on this. Whatever you tell me will not be published unless you agree with it. This is what I tell absolutely everyone that I meet. And I never violate this rule, no matter what it would mean for me, even if it meant that a big story that could end up in a big case, that we wouldn't have that, because that's the absolutely crucial thing. Mr. Kropa, you said that many of the people who disclose information cannot really imagine what it could result in, how big it could eventually get. Are you trying to explain this to them, or do you think that once they came up to see you, they do want to publish the information and that's your job the best way you can? Well, I mostly said that I am not able to imagine how things could turn out in the end, because with those really large cases, always something happens that you cannot predict at all. I have two examples here. I was working on a story where I was contacted by a person whom I reached through another case. So I was aware of him, we had a cup of coffee, and he admitted that he was part in a fraud that he did not want to take part in. It was about European funds and grants, and it was an interesting story because it involved people from the government, and there were high-ranking politicians involved in it. He was extremely afraid. He was very worried about it all, and I told him, which I'm still sorry about that I did, I told him that evil must be fought or collaborated with, that you cannot remain silent. That was the last thing I told him. He said he'd think about it, even though I told him I would not be able to protect him. All those automatic warnings you give people, because we are journalists, there are no policemen standing behind us. He finally decided to help disclose the case, and the end was tragic. He's in prison for another completely unrelated thing, and I am firmly convinced that he's innocent. His family broke, his company was destroyed, and his life will never be such as it would have been if he stayed silent, and if he were willing to coexist with the evil. Another case, there was a person, not a typical whistleblower, but this was the kind of thing that we do, that I had my person among people who were trading with heating oil, because there were notable frauds there. We had a recording of two businessmen who were talking about ordering a murder of another person. And we had that. We had the recording. We were wondering what to do with this, because we knew we had to contact the police, because I do not have any means to stop a murder. And I was sitting with the director and all the deputy directors of a special police department. They shook hands and promised that the case, which was my only case, that the case would not be given to the Moravian department, because I knew that in Moravia there were people in the police force who were collaborating with the gang. I gave them 30 hours of recordings, and thankfully I did not give them the name of the person I had there in the environment. 2 weeks later, they told me they need to forward this case to Moravia. 3 weeks later, people from the gang approached my person and said, Garupa is filing charges, what are we going to do? So I tried to get my person out of the situation, out of the environment, as soon as I can. Thankfully, he was under an assumed identity, so we couldn't do that. And in the end, they were there again, and they told him, you are there on the camera recordings. And of course he was, because he helped make them. But then he moved to another part of the country, and it turned out that the policeman from the organized crime investigation unit sold my file for 7 million crowns. Sold it to those people that were responsible for it. He was sentenced for 8 years, but the life of those people at that moment were threatened in a completely unpredictable manner. We didn't do anything wrong. We went to the police, but the result was potentially life-threatening.
Did it change the way that you approach these people? Did it change the way you think about it? It dramatically changed my attitude to the police. What we need to understand is that the police and the state prosecutor office, there is a chain of people, and it's reasonable to think that there probably is an idiot among them, and that's the better case if it's only an idiot. Ms. Ustuhalova, Mr. Krupa mentioned that as a journalist you don't have a police force having your back. In a regional office, how is it? Do you have legal experts? Do you have anyone who could help whistleblowers? Probably you don't. So what help can you offer them? What help do you offer them apart from your attention and your efforts to investigate it? What we can offer is to refer them to an attorney, to help them get legal counseling, independent attorneys who work with the whistleblowers. What we can do again is to refer them to NGOs, but that's exactly what my colleagues have mentioned. We do not have any police forces at our disposal, so we can offer them counseling, and that's it. And have you had any case that you decided to abandon despite the person being willing to disclose their identity and disclose information because simply we're worried about their lives, about their livelihoods? Well, let me think. I wouldn't say that I was afraid that he might end up badly, because usually in the regions there aren't that many murders. Is that what you mean? Well, yeah, usually it's question of money. Well, she's in Brno, and in Brno there have been shootings. But yeah, we are discussing mafia or police. But usually in the region there are minor cases such as corrupted head teachers or corrupted municipal officials. So of course this is still important, but it's probably not as dangerous. It is a lower level of corruption, because of course corruption is prevalent in all the levels of the state administration, but this is a lower level in the region. So these are basic everyday things. So retaliation usually takes the form of a dismissal, being isolated from by your friends. Your children might have problems at school. You can have problems with your family, with your friends. So it definitely can disrupt their everyday lives. So usually the greater problems that they might face in the region is within the community. What about you, Mr. Malacek? Do you know any trustworthy lawyers, or do you know any NGOs that you can refer your sources or whistleblowers to? Do you have any experience with this? Of course, we do have lawyers in the Czech television who have been cooperating with us, investigative journalists. So that's something that we can do, to sit them down with the whistleblower and to discuss it. But I haven't done it. I have never done it, and I have never been asked by the whistleblower, because very often the people know much better than I do what they could potentially face in terms of retaliation, being dismissed, for example. They can imagine it much better than I can. What I can assess is whether they can be identified from the information that they have reported. If they come from a company that had 150 employees, we are careful still. The identity can remain anonymous, but that is something that also the person needs to know. Let's say that he's reporting information included in an email, so he knows how many people got that particular email. So what I try to do is to be as careful as possible, and this mainly applies to criminal activities or some shady businesses that my colleague Mr. Kropa mentioned. I did a number of cases about gambling, which of course is a legal business, but very often there are ties to more shady businessmen. And of course, here my sources, whistleblowers, they didn't ask me to protect them, but I was worried, and we really wanted to keep their identity disclosed, and we wanted to be even more careful than they wanted us to be. So that's the approach that I've been taking. Sometimes it is necessary, sometimes maybe not, but there are definitely cases when I do it like that. I would really like to ask about keeping your sources anonymous, because from I see from the media, it seems that if there are cases and the sources are anonymous, they really are not acted on as well, they are not investigated as properly, they are not reported as thoroughly as when there is a person that can be tied to the information. So is it important for you to have non-anonymous sources, to be able to provide a real person who can really comment on everything themselves and to have their names and identity? For me, what is ideal is that I don't have to push my viewers to believe me. For me, it is ideal when I have enough evidence that simply presenting the evidence makes it clear to the audience that this is what happened. Keeping the source anonymous, there are two levels of this, or two aspects. So the first one, this is a very bad thing for me, and that's when not even I know the identity. For example, when I receive an anonymous letter or an anonymous email, and they give me a tip and I investigate and I find out that there really is a problem, some unethical behavior, but I can no longer work with the source. Usually when I try to reply to the email, I get no answer. Yeah, of course, that probably applies to information when you need the person, of course. And then another possibility is that I do know the identity of the whistleblower, but we have agreed that the identity won't be disclosed, so the person is anonymous to the public. Yeah, so I was asking about this second possibility, when you do know the whistleblower. So do you think that the message would be stronger, the message would seem more credible if you added the name of the source? That varies. There are cases, for example, of corruption within a state institution. You can support it by documents. Then you can break the story without having the specific person in the limelight. If it's about a person who has suffered some detriment, if you cannot disclose their identity, usually you can't really share the story. So sometimes you do not need the identity of the whistleblower, sometimes you do. We have heard already many of times that whistleblowers first should approach somebody who is experienced in whistleblowing, who has legal knowledge, who can tell them what their rights are, how they can be protected, and only then approach the media. So what is your opinion about this? And how do you act when you are approached through an intermediary, be it an attorney or an NGO? Well, in such a case, I wouldn't cooperate with them. And can I ask you why? If it's a major case, one key thing for me to be able to protect the source is to limit the number of people who know the person's identity. So that is something that is really important for me. Another thing is that I work as an investigative journalist, and we do have a lot of time, and that's great that I can work on one case for 9 months. So there is a long time between my first encounter with the whistleblower and when the case actually is broken to the public. Sometimes it can happen, it will take a week, but sometimes it will take a year. And I don't want other people to be involved in this process because I don't know them, I don't know their background, I don't know who they know. People from NGOs, who knows what they will do? They can go to a pub, they will get a little drunk, they will get a little chatty. And yeah, I can say that Mr. Ondrachka, he does go to pubs. So yeah, you never know what they can do, so maybe they exert pressure because they think that things have been moving slowly, but usually I do have my reasons for acting as I do, so I don't need NGOs, and I don't want to say that they are not necessary, but I don't work like that. But we really need to remind the audience here that you do have lawyers who you can consult with. Yeah, sure, I do have lawyers and I do have a team of people that I can rely on when I need. So how does it work in a regional office of a daily newspapers? You usually probably don't have 9 months for one case. Usually you have 9 hours, and a legal team at your disposal is probably also out of the question. So do you use intermediaries, do you use help of attorneys or NGOs, or do you prefer to involve as few people as possible? Well, I also prefer to involve as few people as possible. because our former superior in the Brno regional office, we had great working conditions as investigative journalist. When I was uncovering the case of the Brno airport, I could work on this case for 3-4 months without being rushed to publish, and now we have been covering the story for a year and a half, and there is no pressure on us to report weekly about news in this case. Or there has been another case which took a year to fully investigate. What sometimes does happen to us that if a whistleblower approaches an NGO or an attorney, they tell him this does not amount to criminal activity, but it can be considered unethical behavior, try contacting the media. So that is something that can happen, but I can't say that we would directly cooperate with NGOs and they would pass on sources to us. So that is not what my experience is. So you do not seek actively this, but are you being approached by NGOs? Yes, it happens. It has happened maybe twice that somebody referred a whistleblower to me, but it's not on a regular basis. We do not have a close cooperation with NGOs. I would also like to ask the audience to submit their questions. You can use the cards and I will get to your questions presently. But first I would like to ask about the cases that we do know, cases of whistleblowers, and they usually do not have happy endings. Mr. Malacek, have you experienced a case, have you ever worked on a case when the end was happier, and was it because of luck? Or why was it that the end was not tragic or very bad for the whistleblower and the case at the same time was investigated? You scare me a little. I haven't been working that long as an investigative journalist, unlike my colleagues. Probably you know me as a foreign reporter for the Czech TV, but I have been working like this for 3 years, and so far I have not encountered any sources who ended up tragically. Of course, there have been people who were dismissed, who lost their jobs, but it was not a surprise for them, and there was nothing I could do, and definitely they didn't blame me for what happened to them. So I think that majority of people who approached me and whose identity was protected, they remained anonymous, so we did whatever we could and nothing bad happened. So what about you, Mr. Kroupa? What's your experience? So do you want to hear about the people who did end up tragically or didn't? Well, do you have any who did not? Well, I don't know, to be honest. One who did not end up tragically is Mr. Michalek, but I really don't know if he is happier as a senator than he was working in the Ministry of the Environment, and he shakes his head probably no. So yeah, another tragic case. Yeah, but majority of whistleblowers, and unfortunately this is something that is inherently included in the situation, in the principle of the whole thing. If they really are whistleblowers or whatever we call them, usually they report about something that is a major case that against someone who is more powerful than they are, who's stronger than they are, bigger than they are, than we are as journalists. And it's really hard to define what victory is in such cases. Is it a victory? I think that maybe it's a victory when the truth is revealed to the public and their motivation is to tell the truth, then they are victors. Of course, there are people who have shadier motives among whistleblowers. There are cases when people want to tell you something, they actively approach you. And to be honest, in the last few years I haven't really experienced that I would be approached to get a tip and started investigating. I do have a phone with a special phone number, and usually I'm not called on this phone, and so I really need to find the people myself. But so unfortunately, those people who decided to stand up against the more powerful opponent, they do not win if we are discussing their everyday lives. If we are talking about the truth, about human courage, then they are victors, and that can be enough, I think. So, apart from Mr. Michalek, do you think there is a case that is a happy ending, and why was there a happy ending? Was it thanks to a good policeman, thanks to a good official? What can work to protect these people and turn their stories into happy endings? I don't know anyone who has had a happy ending. I do know a person who was willing to disclose information. It was about arms deals, and the people that he reported against destroyed his family, and now he has a winery and he is happier than he used to be. So he no longer deals in arms and ammunition, but he deals in wine. So maybe that could be one of the recommendations of this conference: trade guns for wine. And let me ask the same question. Ms. Ostrohalova, do you have an experience that could you use to recommend something to potential whistleblowers? I think that what Mr. Kroupa has said is very important. In the majority of cases, the people are very well aware what they are doing and what they are facing, and very often they report cases that somehow they are involved in themselves. So in the majority of cases, they also do know that probably there is not a happy ending in store for them, and their motivation to disclose information, at least that's what I think, that they simply have the courage and they have a very strong moral code or moral integrity. And now I'm discussing or talking about cases when they are not motivated by revenge or anything purely personal. But in my experience, even in the little cases, what does it mean that you end up badly? And let's say that you report a head teacher that he asked for a bribe at school where you have your children. I don't want to say that this happens often, but it does happen. So what you will definitely have to do is to transfer your child to a different school, because what else can you do? And such little things, there is a lot of them in the region.
People contact you, I suppose, because thanks to the media, the case gets investigated, and this could possibly help them, that they will not be as vulnerable as if they contacted just the police. Do you think they are overestimating the power of the media when they approach you like that? Well, I think really this is, it depends on the case, because the police and the state prosecutor's office should be monitoring the media, and they should act when they feel that there is a need to act, but not even in the most serious cases that we did, unless there were criminal charges filed by somebody else already. Then the police was inactive and didn't do anything. Mr. Marchik, you could probably compare this with other countries because you worked in other countries, and I think that, do you think that the Czech media is weaker, stronger, or doesn't it really compare what the media can do, how they can put pressure on the state to investigate the cases that you uncover? I wouldn't really be able to compare this directly, but there are countries that where I've been for a long time, like Germany and Austria, and there the general awareness about the role of the media and the level of political culture is simply higher. So I think that a certain level of whistleblower protection will be considered a matter of course, that it's an obvious thing. They probably don't talk as much as we do about snitches and rats and so on, if we're talking about really serious cases. But this is more of an impression I have. I never really encountered anything like this abroad, so this is really just anecdotal evidence. But I think that's roughly what it is like. And I have a question from the audience related to this. Is the situation getting worse? And by this specifically we mean that the media is becoming part of structures that grow out of the corruption environment. That's what it says on the card. Is the media failing in its role as a watchdog? What do you think, Mr. Kroupa? Well, this question has two parts. First of all, we have to realize what is the role of journalists. Journalists are the light falling from a lamp. We shine light on the story to make it visible. A journalist who starts to believe that they can resolve the thing by investigate it, solve it, then no longer an investigative journalist. That's not their role. The journalist is not there to resolve the thing. He's there to figure out what has happened and to say out loud what they know. And this is true for investigative journalists far more strongly than for any other type of journalist. You need to take a step back from the case. That's enormously important. From my perspective, when you're in a situation where the Ministry of Finance is the owner of the largest publishing company in the country, and a newspaper that I loved because I worked for the newspaper for many years, this is a situation that by itself is very problematic, because can the journalists be critical towards who is essentially their superior? I do trust the integrity of many of the persons I know who are still at the newspaper, but on the other hand, there are people in the management whom I do not trust at all. So if I understand it correctly, your answer is that we should not expect so much from the media, but also that you feel that there are people who can fulfill the role of the media, that is, shine the light of what is going on. That's not really what I wanted to say. I didn't say much about your expectations. You should expect from the media what the media should do, and what the media should do is that the journalists write about the world as it is. And for an intelligent recipient, it should be obvious that you have to be able to look around yourself and realize that the media is showing just part of the world. I myself only work on crimes, which does not mean that the world consists entirely of crimes. Besides the world that I focus on as a journalist, there are many more parts of the world where people love each other and they are honest and they are being nice all the time. But that's not what my stories are about. The world that we show, which is the world of crime and the world of all sorts of wrongdoings, things that are wrong and bad. But this part should also be viewed through a critical lens. And I want the person who is watching the report or listening to the report to experience it critically, to know that the world as I know it is much more than this, and to this what I see I can add what I know. And this is what I as a journalist expect from my audience. And I hope that the audience expects me to be showing facts and giving them true information. Mrs. Ustovala wanted to respond to that, probably about the love and happiness. Not necessarily, no. I think I'm part of that, perhaps, because we're talking about the media in the abstract, but there's a line that runs through the individual offices, and it's about individual people. As Senator Laska mentioned in the previous discussion, because I was here for that, there are people, there are journalists who have a track record, and we know that their work is good, we know that they're honest, and there is a probably larger number of journalists who are not quite as responsible, who you cannot take seriously, or at least you have to doubt and you have to question what they write. But I think this could probably apply to a very informed consumer of the media. This is probably not something you could expect from absolutely everybody, because not everyone has the time to follow and remember individual journalists. So perhaps the media should be doing it, that they guarantee the reliability of the information. Well, it used to work like that, yes. But unfortunately, the situation today is so fragmented that in our office alone, it's really about individual people sitting in the office. Just one more thing about that, and I think it's very important, and I think this is a general remark. The fact that there are rich people who own certain Czech media, this carries two problems, a smaller one and a bigger one. The small one is what we are talking about. This is the fact that the oligarch will force the journalist to write something or not to write something, which is a very risky endeavor, because the journalist, of course, can fight back, because journalists tend to be fairly free-thinking persons. And we don't really like being pushed to do something. But that's the smaller problem. The bigger one is that the newspaper, that's not just a list of articles that may be truthful, but the newspaper is there to show the world as it is, to select content. And this selection of content is what the newspaper is saying about the world. The topics that they cover, and they can be covering these topics truthfully, 100% truthfully. And you can see this in the newspaper owned by the Mafra company. You can see that they are having an accent on certain topics. There is an emphasis on something, and even though the articles themselves are perfectly right and above board, the journalists work perfectly, but the image of the world in the mirror of the newspaper is distorted. It's a specific perception of a specific type of person who is the owner of the newspaper. And I think this is a much greater problem than censorship of individual articles, because this really is something that the journalists can defend themselves against. But you can use a list of perfectly truthful articles to create a false image of the world. And that's the tragedy of Czech media today. Let's go to a much more narrower topic, because now we're getting to something that's far too important to be just neglected here, that would deserve a conference of its own. I have a question related to something that we said right at the start. The truthfulness of your source, the reliability of your source. Has it ever happened that a whistleblower or a source, probably a source in this case, was lying to you all the time? Did you feel manipulated? Did you feel abused? Because after all, you're not perfect, so did you perhaps fall into somebody's trap? yes, this happens very often. Not necessarily that you fall for it, that people try it. I wouldn't say it's a majority of the reports that I get, but I'd say it's a significant part of what we receive in our program. It doesn't always have to be a deliberate lie, but it's an attempt to use you in a very local, very personal dispute. And of course you have to uncover that and not do the story, because I can't really remember where I've really served as somebody's useful idiot, as a weapon in a competition fight. It may have happened and I never learned about it. That, of course, is possible. But there were cases of, say, competition disputes where the decision to do the report was backed by a legitimate public interest. Let's say a company did not win a public contract because the competitor was bribing someone. Then this is clearly competition, but there is public interest because there is corruption involved. So that's legitimate, and there's nothing wrong about covering the story and disclosing corruption of whatever company is involved. So really this is on a case-by-case basis, and we're trying to eliminate cases where this is really only about abusing us, using us as a trump card in a personal dispute. Of course, I don't want to suggest that you sometimes fell for it. I just wanted to ask if you were aware of any story like that. I am not aware of ever falling into such a trap myself, because the basic criterion for publishing a story is truth or lie. That's the first thing. Then there's another list of criteria, of course, where I can give you an example. There was a former head of a police investigation unit, police intelligence unit. He was distributing photographs that people that he hired took on a beach of Monte Angitario, where there were meetings between the Prime Minister at that time and various businessmen. He had a personal dispute with the Prime Minister and with the Prime Minister's government, and I'm sure he had good motivations as well, but he wanted these pictures to be published in the media. And he came to the newspaper where I worked at that time, though he did not contact me personally, but we had a meeting over this and we were talking about it in a wider, say, consortium, and we decided to either give him back the pictures and say we're not publishing this unless disclosing you as the source, because you are the former head of the intelligence unit of the Secret Service, and the fact that it's you disclosing the information is important for the story. So either we don't do it at all, or we do it with your name as well. And he agreed, and we published it with his name as well. I wasn't part of the discussion with him personally, but as a result of the meeting, the journalist went to see the person, and he clearly agreed because we published it all. It sometimes happens that you throw someone away with the information, and a month later you read the same story in another newspaper. That happens. We have 3 more minutes, so let's try to squeeze in 2 questions. One is about sources in general and their importance for journalists. Do you think that our sources are protected well in the Czech Republic in terms of in terms of law as well? So, do you have to disclose your sources if this would threaten them? I have something about that, and the police knows this, even at the lowest levels, because I was investigated several times. I had to report at the police due to several articles, and the policeman, the first thing he told me was, I know that you have to protect your sources, that you don't have to tell me anything, which is pretty much where the inquiry ended, because that was it. But the protection as it is stated in the laws, I think it's enough, at least for the basic types of cases. I would disagree with that. I've talked to the police so many times that they started tapping my phone. Then other journalists discovered that my phone was tapped. They wrote about it. We filed a complaint that's now with the Constitutional Court, which is to decide whether the police can wiretap a journalist if they want to discover a source. As far as I know, the Czech TV was searched once, and the police was trying to discover who was the source of journalists. So whatever a rank-and-file policeman tells you, I wouldn't necessarily believe that, because it does not have to be the truth. Yes, we've heard both sides, and I think both of them are valid. Of course, these are really extreme cases. When we did have the military police at Czech TV, I think that's absolutely unacceptable. But the case was handled in some way. I think the people from the military police had to resign or something like that. But yes, things like this also happen. And the last question, 1 or 3 sentences. Do you think there's something that could change in the Czech Republic to make the protection of whistleblowers better? And this is a question from the audience. Protect them against the corrupt law enforcement officers and representatives, because we are talking about legal protection of whistleblowers. So is there anything the state could do to help? I'm afraid there is no simple solution. All the legal awareness, the political culture, after all, the quality of the media, trust in the media, all that would have to improve. And if that improves, whistleblower protection and witness protection will improve as well. I don't think this is going to change overnight. There's no panacea that will improve everything. I think that because there is no clear legal basis for whistleblowing at this point compared to Slovakia, that this is the foundation that we simply do not have and should have. And Mr. Kropa? I don't really see any problems here. I think that, again, this conference is just dealing with one part of the world, and we have to realize that besides this part of the world, there are many others. So the cases that we're talking about here, in terms of the general good, they ended well because we know about them. So as long as we learn about these things when they happen, it's not quite as bad as it sounds. Thank you very much for taking part of the debate. Thanks to Jana Ustoholova, Jan Moláček and Jan Kropa, and thank all of you for your attention and the organizers for inviting us here.